The wind howled across the desolate Arctic expanse, a biting cold that seeped through even the thickest of fabrics. Snow swirled in the air, creating a white veil that obscured the land. The Zarthan hunters, covered in their metallic suits that gleamed even in the dim Arctic light, trudged forward with purpose. Their leader, Earkath, moved with a determined stride, his eyes scanning the horizon. Earth's predators are weak, Earkath muttered, his voice distorted slightly through his helmet. This will be a quick hunt. The hunters chuckled in agreement, their breath visible in the frigid air. They had traveled across galaxies, conquering every beast that stood in their way. Earth's creatures, they believed, would be no different, an easy conquest to add to their growing collection of trophies. Earkath's eyes, however, were sharp and calculating. He wasn't just here to hunt, he was here to prove something, to show that the Zarthan were superior in every way. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl pierced through the wind, freezing the laughter in their throats. Earkath raised his hand, signaling silence. The hunters stopped, their senses now fully alert. "Did you hear that?" asked Kalor, the youngest of the group, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and fear. "It's just the wind." Another hunter scoffed, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. Earkath shook his head. "No, that was not the wind," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That was a challenge." They continued forward, more cautiously now, their senses heightened. The snow crunched under their boots, each step echoing in the eerie silence that had fallen. The landscape was a stark white canvas, broken only by the occasional rise of ice and the dark silhouettes of distant mountains. As they moved deeper into the Arctic wilderness, the growl sounded again, this time closer, more menacing. Earkath stopped and motioned for the others to spread out. "We are not alone," he whispered, his breath fogging the inside of his helmet. "Prepare the traps." The hunters quickly set to work, deploying their advanced technology. Energy nets, invisible to the naked eye, hummed as they activated, creating a web of light designed to capture anything that moved. They positioned themselves strategically, each hunter taking a point around the perimeter. Minutes passed in tense silence. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the soft hum of the energy nets. Then, from the corner of his eye, Earkath saw movement, a flash of white against the snow. His heart raced as he turned, his gaze locking onto a pair of cold, dark eyes staring back at him through the snowstorm. "It's here," he whispered into his communicator. "The hunt begins." The polar bear moved with a grace and power that belied its size, its massive paws making barely a sound on the snow. Earkath watched, mesmerized, as the bear approached the first of the traps. Just as it was about to step into the energy net, it paused, sniffing the air. The bear's eyes narrowed, and with a sudden burst of speed, it turned and dashed to the side, avoiding the trap entirely. "How did it?" Kalor began, but Earkath cut him off. "It knows," he said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and frustration. "It understands." The hunters quickly adjusted their positions, trying to anticipate the bear's movements. But each time they thought they had it cornered, the bear would change direction, using the terrain to its advantage. It leapt over a snowdrift, landing silently behind a rise of ice. It moved like a ghost, there one moment and gone the next. Earkath could feel his frustration growing. This was no ordinary hunt. This creature was not like the others they had faced. It was clever, resourceful, and most of all, it was fearless. The polar bear circled them, testing their defenses, its dark eyes never leaving them. "We need to think," Earkath muttered. "This is not just about strength, it's about survival. This bear is fighting for its home." As the hunters regrouped, the bear made its move. It charged at one of the traps, then veered sharply to the left, causing the energy net to miss by inches. It was a feint, a deliberate maneuver to test their response. Earkath watched, realization dawning on him. This was not a beast acting on instinct alone, it was a predator with a strategy. "We need to change our tactics," Earkath said, turning to his team. "We're not dealing with a mindless animal. This bear is as much a hunter as we are." The hunters nodded, their earlier confidence replaced by a grudging respect for their adversary. They adjusted their formation, readying themselves for the next encounter. The bear, sensing the shift in their approach, paused on a hillock, its breath visible in the cold air, its eyes fixed on them with a mix of curiosity and challenge. Earcath knew then that this would not be a simple hunt. This was a battle of wits, a test of endurance and will. As he stared into the bear's eyes, he felt a surge of determination. This was the challenge he had been seeking, the true test of a hunter. The hunt, he realized, had only just begun. The silence was almost deafening in the wake of the polar bear's latest maneuver. The Zarthan hunters, normally so composed and confident, were visibly unsettled. Earcath's sharp eyes tracked the bear's every move, trying to anticipate its next step. He could sense the unease among his team. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a simmering tension. "Hold your positions," Earcath commanded, his voice firm but low. He knew they could not afford to make any mistakes. Every step they took now had to be calculated, every action deliberate. The polar bear was not a creature to be underestimated, and Earcath understood this more than ever. Kalor, positioned to the left, glanced nervously at Earcath. "What do we do, leader?" he asked, his tone betraying his anxiety. "It's like it's playing with us." "It's testing us," Earcath corrected. "Learning our tactics. We have to stay ahead of it, anticipate its moves." The wind picked up again, swirling snowflakes around them in a blinding flurry. The bear was now out of sight, concealed by the icy landscape. But Earcath knew it was there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He could feel it, a predatory patience that matched their own. "We need to change our approach," Earcath said, turning to his team. "Set up the acoustic disruptors. We'll use sound to confuse it, make it reveal itself." The hunters moved quickly, pulling out small, disc-like devices from their packs. They placed them strategically around the perimeter, embedding them in the snow. When activated, these disruptors would emit frequencies designed to disorient even the most agile of predators. As the devices came online, a low hum began to fill the air, almost imperceptible at first but gradually growing in intensity. Earcath watched the landscape intently, his senses on high alert. He knew the bear wouldn't be fooled for long, but even a momentary advantage could turn the tide in their favor. Suddenly, a movement, a flash of white against white. The bear emerged from behind an ice ridge, its massive form clearly visible now. It shook its head, visibly affected by the disruptors, but its eyes remained focused, calculating. "There!" Kalor shouted, raising his weapon. Earcath quickly motioned for him to hold fire. "Wait!" he ordered. "Let it come closer." The bear advanced cautiously, its steps deliberate. Despite the confusion caused by the disruptors, it seemed to understand that its usual tactics wouldn't work. It paused, sniffing the air, then began to circle around the disruptors, searching for the source of the sound. Earcath's heart pounded in his chest. This was their chance. He signaled for his team to spread out, ready to close in from all sides. The bear, now fully aware of the hunter's presence, let out a deep growl that echoed through the frozen air. "Stay sharp," Earcath whispered into his communicator. "This is where it gets dangerous." As the bear moved closer to the center of their formation, the hunters tightened their circle, weapons raised. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Then, without warning, the bear lunged forward, a blur of motion and muscle. It moved with a speed and agility that defied its size, barreling straight toward one of the disruptors. "Now!" Earcath shouted. The hunters sprang into action, firing their weapons. Beams of light cut through the snow, targeting the bear. But the creature was faster than they had anticipated. It twisted in midair, dodging the beams with a grace that left the hunters stunned. "Impossible!" Kalor muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. The bear landed on its feet, skidding across the ice but maintaining its balance. It turned its head, its eyes locking onto Earcath. In that moment, he saw not just an animal, but a formidable adversary, one that understood the stakes as well as they did. "Fall back!" Earcath commanded, realizing they needed more distance. The hunters retreated, their movements coordinated, but the bear didn't give chase. Instead, it stood its ground, watching them with a calm intensity. "This isn't just about territory," Earcath said, more to himself than to his team. "It's protecting something, or someone." A sudden thought struck him. The bear's behavior, its strategic retreats, its defensive posture, it all pointed to something more than instinct. He looked around, scanning the horizon, and then he saw it, a small, barely visible structure in the distance, nestled against the ice. "There," he said, pointing. "It's not alone. There's something over there. We need to check it out." The team moved cautiously toward the structure, keeping an eye on the bear. As they approached, the outline became clearer, a makeshift shelter, half buried in snow. The bear remained still, a silent guardian standing between them and the shelter. Earcath's mind raced. Could there be someone inside? A human, perhaps, lost in this unforgiving wilderness? It would explain the bear's behavior, its willingness to confront them despite the odds. "Kalor, you're with me," Earcath said. "The rest of you, keep the bear distracted. But don't engage unless necessary. We need to know what's inside that shelter." Kalor nodded, his grip on his weapon tightening. Together, they moved toward the structure, the bear watching their every step. As they drew closer, Earcath could see a faint glow coming from within, a sign of life, of hope. But just as they reached the entrance, the bear charged, a roaring mass of fury and strength. Earcath and Kalor barely had time to react, diving out of the way as the bear slammed into the ground where they had stood moments before. "Go!" Earcath shouted, pushing Kalor toward the shelter. "Find out what's inside." Kalor scrambled to his feet, rushing toward the entrance. Earcath turned to face the bear, his weapon raised, but he hesitated. There was something in the bear's eyes, something more than animal instinct. There was intelligence, a purpose. He lowered his weapon, a realization dawning on him. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a test, a challenge not just of strength, but of understanding. And in that moment, Earcath knew he was facing something far greater than he had ever anticipated. The bear stood its ground, breathing heavily, its eyes locked onto Earcath. It was waiting, watching. Earcath nodded slowly, acknowledging the unspoken challenge between them. The hunt had changed, and so had the hunters. This was no longer a mere game of survival. It was a test of worth, a confrontation of wills. And Earcath was determined to prove that he was worthy of this formidable opponent. As the cold wind whipped around them, Earcath prepared for the next move in this deadly dance, knowing that the true battle was just beginning. The Arctic wind sliced through the air like a blade, its icy tendrils seeping into the hunters' suits despite their advanced thermal technology. Earcath kept his eyes on the polar bear, now standing motionless a mere 20 feet away. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the weight of every decision bearing down on him. This was no ordinary animal. It was a guardian, a sentient being with a mission to protect. He had to tread carefully. Behind him, Kalor edged closer to the shelter's entrance, his breath shallow with both excitement and fear. The glow from inside flickered like a dying ember, casting long shadows on the snow. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the snow itself resisted his approach. He glanced back at Earcath, seeking reassurance, but the leader's focus was entirely on the bear. "What's inside, Kalor?" Earcath asked without turning, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Kalor hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the shelter's flap. "I don't know yet. A sudden roar from the bear cut him off, its guttural sound echoing across the frozen landscape. It charged forward, each stride powerful and deliberate. Earcath's instincts kicked in, and he raised his weapon, but his finger hovered over the trigger. Shooting felt wrong. This creature was more than a target. It was a challenge, a living embodiment of Earth's primal strength. "Kalor, now!" Earcath shouted, snapping Kalor out of his hesitation. The younger hunter yanked open the flap and disappeared inside. Earcath stepped back, his weapon still raised but his mind racing with uncertainty. The bear stopped short, planting its paws in the snow, eyes locked onto him with a mix of defiance and expectation. Inside the shelter, Kalor's eyes adjusted to the dim light. He could make out a small, makeshift cot in one corner, covered with a thermal blanket. A tiny heater buzzed quietly, barely keeping the cold at bay. But what caught his attention was the small figure huddled under the blanket, a child, no more than 8 years old, shivering and barely conscious. "Leader," Kalor called out, his voice cracking with disbelief. "There's a human child here, barely alive." Earkatha's gaze flicked toward the shelter, then back to the bear. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just a random encounter. The bear wasn't merely defending its territory, it was protecting the child. A fierce determination welled up within Earkath, but also a newfound respect for the creature before him. "Stay with the child," Earkath instructed, his tone shifting from command to empathy. "Keep it safe." Kalor nodded, moving to wrap the child in the blanket more securely. The bear watched, its breath visible in the frigid air, its muscles tense but unmoving. Earkath slowly lowered his weapon, taking a step back as a gesture of goodwill. "We mean no harm," Earkath said softly, unsure if the bear could understand but hoping his intent would be clear. "We only seek to protect." The bear's ears twitched, as if processing the words. For a long, tense moment neither moved. Then, slowly, the bear relaxed, lowering its head slightly in what Earkath interpreted as a nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't submission, but a mutual recognition of purpose, a truce, if only temporary. Inside, Kalor gently lifted the child, who stirred weakly in his arms. The boy's eyes fluttered open, glazed with confusion and fear. "Easy, little one," Kalor whispered, trying to sound soothing. "We're here to help." The child's lips moved, forming words too faint to hear. Kalor leaned closer, catching a whispered, "Bear friend." He glanced back at the opening, where Earkath stood facing the bear, the strange standoff continuing in a fragile balance. Outside, Earkath remained still, his posture calm but ready. "We'll take the child to safety," he continued, his voice steady and respectful. "You have my word." The bear seemed to consider this, its eyes narrowing as it studied him. There was intelligence in its gaze, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. Earkath felt a strange kinship with the creature. Both were guardians, in their own ways. Kalor emerged from the shelter, the child cradled in his arms. "Leader, we need to get him to warmth, quickly," he urged, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. Earkath nodded, slowly backing away from the bear while signaling his team to follow suit. "Keep your weapons down," he ordered quietly. "We're not here to fight." The hunters complied, moving carefully, their movements deliberate and non-threatening. The bear watched every step, its eyes following the child as Kalor carried him away. When they reached a safe distance, Earkath turned to face the bear once more. "We'll leave you in peace," he said, his words hanging in the cold air like a promise. "Thank you?" The bear remained still, its expression unreadable. For a moment, Earkath thought it might charge again, but instead, it slowly lowered itself onto the snow, maintaining its vigilant watch. As the hunters retreated, Earkath felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This encounter had been more than a hunt, it had been a lesson in humility, in understanding the true nature of strength. The bear had taught him that there were forces in the universe that couldn't be conquered with technology or brute strength alone. Back at their landing site, the team prepared to depart, the child now wrapped in thermal blankets, and placed gently inside the cabin of their ship. Kalor looked at Earkath, his eyes filled with questions. "What do we tell the council, leader?" he asked quietly. Earkath glanced back toward the distant figure of the bear, still watching them from afar. "We tell them the truth," he replied. "That there is much we do not understand about this world. And that its guardians are not to be taken lightly." The ship's engines roared to life, lifting them into the frigid sky. As they ascended, Earkath kept his gaze fixed on the ground below, watching the bear grow smaller and smaller until it was just a dot on the vast white landscape. But in his mind, the image remained clear, a proud, powerful guardian, standing firm in defense of its world. As they broke through the cloud cover and into the endless black of space, Aarkath knew that this encounter would stay with him forever. It had been a test of strength, but also of spirit. And as far as he was concerned, the bear had proven itself the true victor. The polar bear's breath hung in the icy air, a misty plume that mingled with the snow flurries drifting down from the darkened sky. Aarkath stood a few paces away, his weapon lowered but his muscles tense, ready to react. The shelter behind him seemed to pulse with an almost palpable energy, a silent reminder of what was at stake. The bear's eyes never left him, an unyielding challenge reflected in its gaze. "We're not enemies," Aarkath spoke softly, more to himself than the creature before him. Yet he could sense the truth in his words. The bear wasn't just protecting its territory, it was guarding something precious. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. Kalor emerged from the shelter, his face pale. "There's a child in there," he said, voice shaking slightly. "Human and barely alive. The bear must be trying to protect it." Aarkath's mind raced. The situation had shifted dramatically. What he had initially thought was a simple hunt had become something far more complicated. If the bear was indeed safeguarding a human child, that changed everything. They could no longer afford to see it merely as a target. "We need to get that child out of here," Aarkath said, his voice steady but urgent. "And we need to do it without further provoking the bear." Kalor glanced nervously at the massive creature. "How do we do that?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "That thing doesn't seem like it's ready to let us anywhere near." Aarkath took a deep breath, assessing the situation. The bear's posture was defensive but not overtly aggressive. It was a line in the snow, drawn with silent authority. He had seen this behavior before, in his own hunting practices, a predator not looking for a fight, but ready to defend. "Step back slowly," Aarkath instructed. "Give it space. We need to show we're not a threat." The hunters began to retreat, moving cautiously away from the shelter and the bear. The creature watched them, its gaze unwavering, but it did not advance. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by a fragile understanding. "What's your plan?" Kalor whispered, keeping his eyes on the bear. "We wait," Aarkath replied. "Let it see we mean no harm. If we're lucky, it might allow us to help." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the hunters stood their ground, maintaining their distance. The wind had calmed, and the snow fell gently, casting a soft, eerie glow over the scene. The bear, too, remained still, a silent sentinel in the snow. Finally, the bear took a step back, then another, creating a narrow path between itself and the shelter. Aarkath's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was the moment of truth. "Go," he said to Kalor. "Slowly, and keep your hands visible. If it moves, stop." Kalor nodded, taking a tentative step forward. The bear watched, but did not react. Another step, then another. Each movement was deliberate, careful, as if walking on a razor's edge. Aarkath held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled tight with anticipation. When Kalor reached the shelter, he crouched low, speaking softly to the child inside. The boy was small, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Kalor whispered, his voice soothing. "We're here to help. We're going to get you out of here." The bear shifted slightly, and Aarkath felt a surge of anxiety. But then the creature settled, its gaze softening just a fraction. It was allowing them to help. Kalor carefully lifted the child, wrapping him in a thick thermal blanket to shield him from the cold. "I've got him," he said, voice low. "Let's move." Slowly, the hunters began to back away, keeping their eyes on the bear. The creature stood still, its expression unreadable, but it made no move to follow. As they retreated further, Aarkath felt a strange sense of relief mixed with awe. This wasn't just about survival or territory. It was something deeper, something almost noble. Once they were a safe distance away, the hunters quickened their pace, moving swiftly across the ice toward their ship. The child clung to Kalor, his small body shivering despite the blanket. Aarkath kept a careful watch, glancing back occasionally to see the bear still standing by the shelter, its form growing smaller in the distance. "We did it," Kalor breathed, a smile breaking through his tense expression. "We actually did it." Aarkath nodded, though his mind was still racing. They had succeeded, but the encounter had left him with more questions than answers. What had driven the bear to protect the child so fiercely? And why had it allowed them to leave, once it was clear they meant no harm? As they reached the ship, Aarkath cast one last glance toward the distant figure of the bear. He felt a strange kinship with the creature, a recognition of a shared understanding that transcended words. They were both protectors, in their own way, bound by a code of survival and respect. As the ship's engines roared to life, lifting them off the frozen ground, Aarkath made a silent vow. He would return to this place, not as a hunter, but as a student. There was much to learn from the creatures of this world, much that could not be understood through force or conquest. The Arctic landscape stretched out beneath them, vast and unyielding. And as they soared into the sky, Aarkath knew that the true challenge was just beginning, a challenge not of strength, but of wisdom. And for that, he was ready. The hunt had ended, but a new journey had begun.